Hello and welcome to the Best Practices Summit. Pollinator Friendly Alliance is a grassroots 501c3 nonprofit that protects the natural world through the conservation of pollinators. Our co-host is the Xerces Society, a science-based nonprofit.
My name is Emily May. I'm a pollinator conservation specialist with the Pesticide program at the Xerces Society. And I'm here to talk with you today about herbicide impacts on pollinators from the landscape scale nationally down to the restoration scale. So I'm going to talk about where herbicides kind of fit into an integrated weed management approach for land managers, and some case studies for invasive species management and site preparation, keeping pollinator conservation front and center. This is kind of the first chance I've had to talk about this issue specifically, this topic. So I hope it's interesting to you, and I'm looking forward to questions and feedback. So just to set the stage for why and how I'm talking about herbicides, I wanted to talk about one of our goals in the Xerces pesticide program, which is to help both urban and agricultural spaces realize their potential for successful pollinator conservation. Pollinators need three basic things: food, shelter, and protection from pesticides. Healthy habitat is really the base of the pyramid for pollinator protection. And then to keep it healthy, you need to protect pollinators and their habitat from pesticides, including insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. So when I was putting this talk together, I thought herbicides, that's a huge topic. Where the heck do I start? So I figured let's start at 30,000 feet. Let's talk about issues with herbicide use at that landscape level. And then we can dial back down to the small scales where individuals like us can make actual choices. So the biggest sources of herbicide use across millions of acres is row crop agriculture. Over half of ag pesticide sales in the US are herbicides. And among those, the most widely used herbicide in the US is glyphosate. About 80 or 90% of glyphosate use in the US is in agriculture. So a big driver of that agricultural herbicide use is herbicide-resistant crops, as we're all aware, and the simplicity and the low labor needs of managing weeds in those crops with chemicals. The economies of scale with that kind of crop production, of mechanized crop production, have meant ever bigger fields, larger fields, less habitat for pollinators and other wildlife in tree lines and fence rows. And herbicide weed management writ large has also meant fewer flowering plants available for pollinators and other wildlife in those crop fields and nearby field margins. So the biggest impact of herbicides nationally has been this indirect impact of the loss of forage for our native insects across much of the US. So one of the stories there is the resource base for monarchs in the Midwest, which has been permanently reduced by that universal adoption of herbicide-resistant row crops. So as glyphosate use in herbicide-resistant crops increased, milkweeds declined across the Midwest. You can see that massive increase in glyphosate use by year and crop in the figure on the left, which shows glyphosate use from 1992 to 2019 based on data from the US Ag Census. Research out of Iowa State found steep declines in milkweeds in agricultural spaces, as well as some non-agricultural spaces in Iowa from the late 90s to 2010, that same time period where glyphosate use was increasing rapidly. There was about a 30% decline for non-agricultural milkweeds and an 80% decline for agricultural milkweeds in this time period based on their volunteer monitoring efforts there. So in 1999, milkweeds in ag fields constituted a little over half of total milkweeds, but by 2010, we're less than a quarter of the total milkweeds in their Iowa monitoring project. So on the right here is a figure of the estimate of monarch egg production in the Midwest over that same time period. So you see a steep decline over the time period where glyphosate was increasing in use. Reliance on herbicides for ag weed management has meant this massive loss of food resources for monarchs across this really important part of their migratory route through the US. And thanks to years of over-reliance on glyphosate, we're seeing the breakdown of that weed management system. Dozens of glyphosate-resistant weed species across millions of acres in the US. That has sent seed and chemical companies scrambling to develop new seed and chemical products for herbicide-based row crop management, which includes crops resistance to the herbicides dicamba and 2,4-D. These are plant growth regulator herbicides that are prone to vapor drift, which can move really far from the site of application before depositing out on plants. So over the past 5 years, we've seen this huge spike in herbicide drift injury across the Midwest and Mid-South, which is affecting specialty crops like tomatoes and peaches, and also wild plants and ornamental plants, backyards and natural areas. We're seeing these impacts. Drift injury is more subtle than just the loss of milkweeds from a crop field. It's something like stunted growth and delayed flowering. These drift level doses of dicamba and 2,4-D can reduce nectar and pollen production, affect the plant's ability to reproduce. So this means a loss of forage quality for herbivores, pollinators, the rest of the food web. First, we saw that loss of wild flowering plants in ag fields from glyphosate, and now we're seeing this drift damage from the herbicides replacing glyphosate in this herbicide treadmill that we're on. So that I wanted to just start with the biggest impact of herbicide on pollinators nationally, which is that loss of food and shelter across millions of acres. But I also wanted to be able to dial into some of the direct impacts so that we can think about, as practitioners, how it might affect our choices when it comes to herbicides. So what happens when a pollinator comes into direct contact with an herbicide? What's the risk? There are two factors in the risk of any pesticide to a pollinator. On the one side is toxicity, that capacity of a pesticide to cause harm. How toxic is it? In what way? The other factor that determines risk is exposure. How much of the pesticide is a pollinator exposed to? Was it exposed on the outside of its body, or did it ingest the pesticide in pollen and nectar, or in the leaves of its host plant, or in soil as it's building its nest? How long was that exposure? Was it one time, or was it continuous exposure over time in its food? So basically what risk boils down to is the dose makes the poison. A highly toxic pesticide that a pollinator is minimally exposed to might be less risky than a less toxic pesticide that a pollinator is constantly exposed to. So this is what helps us kind of think about how we can reduce risk to pollinators by thinking about both toxicity and exposure. We still have a lot to learn about how and where and how much bees are exposed to herbicides. Herbicides are actually the least common type of pesticide found in honeybee hive materials, which could be for a number of reasons, but including the fact that plants often die before bees collect herbicide-contaminated nectar, as opposed to fungicides or insecticides, which might remain present in that plant and available to collect for a longer period of time. But let's talk about what we know about herbicide toxicity to pollinators. There's really limited research on herbicide toxicity beyond the standardized toxicity testing that's conducted as part of the EPA registration process for pesticides. So this standard acute toxicity test looks at how many of a test population of adult honeybees are killed within 2 days of when different doses of a pesticide's active ingredient are applied to their thorax, like this lovely picture that I've created here. The EPA then classifies pesticides into 3 toxicity groupings: highly toxic, moderately toxic, and, quote, practically non-toxic. And I say quote because there are many pesticides in that practically non-toxic category that have important harmful effects that just isn't captured by looking at whether adult honeybees die in the 2 days after exposure. These groupings in terms of toxicity are a really blunt tool, and some pesticides fall sort of on the cusp between groupings, and some just have effects that aren't well captured by that toxicity measurement in the first place. In terms of herbicides, most fall into the low toxicity grouping based on this acute testing. Some are classified, a handful are classified as moderately toxic to honeybees. Most of the pesticides that are classified as highly toxic are insecticides. So importantly on this note, as I'll talk about again in a minute, the standardized lab testing for acute toxicity to bees is conducted with just the active ingredient of the pesticide. So for example, glyphosate, and not the end use formulated product, which is like Roundup. In terms of other research, there's very little additional research filling us in on those additional harmful effects that don't reach the point of killing a bee. The vast majority of that additional research, where it is available, has looked at glyphosate. Most other herbicides are a black box beyond that standardized testing. Again, that EPA standard test just looks at one outcome, which is death within 48 hours. But pesticides can have many other important impacts that fall short of killing a bee. They might affect a pollinator's ability to survive or reproduce in the long term. So in terms of a short roundup of some things that we've learned from additional research on herbicides, most of which come from glyphosate and honeybees in lab studies, glyphosate has been found to impair navigation and learning in honeybees, to induce changes in bees' microbiome in their guts, which could have impacts on how well they're able to respond to other stressors, like the introduction of a gut pathogen or exposure to other pesticides in the landscape as they're flying around. It's also been found to delay molting, reduce weight of honeybee brood, have other impacts on brood development. In terms of other herbicides beyond glyphosate, the herbicide 2,4-D was found to cause mortality to newly emerged honeybees and prevent brood development in a study way back in the 70s. You had to really dig for some of these herbicide research papers. Some other common herbicides like atrazine and metolachlor have been found to affect the honeybee immune system. Some have, in terms of other species outside of bees, some herbicides have been found to have some toxicity to different butterfly species. Feeding on plants that were treated with dicamba reduced caterpillar and pupil mass of painted lady butterflies. That kind of herbicide exposure that reduces caterpillar or pupil survivorship could reduce populations over time. There have been some other effects found on butterfly survival and weight that have been found for other systemic herbicides beyond glyphosate, including triclopyr, sethoxydim, and imazapyr. So all of these effects, and I feel like I could have spent this entire presentation going study to study, looking at impacts of different herbicides, but this is a practitioners conference, so I did want to make time for some practices and solutions coming up. But in any case, all of these studies, all of the limited research that is available reveal some level of toxicity from herbicides. None are things that are captured by our pesticide regulatory system. Just one more slide on that idea. I wanted to come back to something I mentioned earlier, which was that lab tests for acute toxicity testing for EPA registration are conducted with just the active ingredient, so like glyphosate, and not the formulated end-use product like Roundup. Other ingredients and formulations are often considered inert. They're considered proprietary information. So if lab tests do suggest some kind of adverse effect of the active ingredient on an insect, then field testing could occur using the formulated end-use product. But if the toxicity is coming from the formulation itself, it would be missed by that first standardized toxicity test for bees. And this is really an unfortunate gap in our regulatory system, because as we're learning, formulations can be much more toxic than their active ingredient alone. Formulations are the package for delivering the main ingredient of a pesticide. So increasing toxicity to the target is what those packaging ingredients are meant to do. This figure on the left is from a recent study that looked at the toxicity of a formulated glyphosate herbicide applied directly to bees, and also looked at the formulation without glyphosate in it, without the active ingredient. And it turned out that the Roundup formulation without glyphosate was the source of mortality to the bees in the study. So these co-formulates considered inert by our regulatory system are in fact potential sources of harm, and an important thing to keep in mind when we're digging into the research on herbicides and other pesticides. Did they test the end-use product, or were they just looking at the active ingredient? So that was getting into the weeds a bit on the toxicity part of the equation. And I've talked about how large-scale ag uses of herbicides are problematic, but I wanted to spend the second part of this presentation thinking about herbicides and land management, and for land managers dealing with invasive species or trying to ensure that a restoration planting is going to succeed in an area that has these competitive, often non-native species, because herbicides can be an important tool in these situations. So in terms of our approach at Xerces, we use the precautionary principle. We take a cautious approach. With herbicides, they're not as toxic as insecticides, but they're likely not risk-free. So we do want to do what we can to minimize how much bees and other beneficial insects might be exposed to. So let's talk through a little bit about how we can integrate multiple strategies for weed management and how we can minimize risk to bees and other pollinators where herbicides are used. So if for land management, we're encouraging land managers who are managing weeds in parks or natural areas, roadsides, et cetera, to be using an integrated vegetation management plan that uses least harmful methods first. Integrated weed management has the same principles, the same framework as the broader concept of integrated pest management, monitoring and surveying for noxious weeds, understanding species life cycles and biology to best target management, emphasizing preventive strategies such as mechanical and cultural methods before turning to herbicides, and integrating multiple control methods that account for human safety, environmental impact, and labor and budget constraints. So for weeds in particular, that monitoring and early intervention piece are really critical. In this kind of integrated vegetation management framework, chemical control would be used when other strategies have been exhausted or aren't feasible or effective. Where herbicides are being used, we want to make sure that those applications are really thoughtful and targeted, thinking about species biology and life cycle. We want to be applying herbicides at the stage of growth for that species when the weed is going to be most vulnerable and the application likely to be most successful, so that you aren't overusing them by applying them at ineffective times. So I'll talk just a couple slides about different strategies to integrate here for weed management. What does prevention look like for weed management? It's thinking about limiting disturbance to landscape, especially disturbances that create bare soil, replanting and reseeding after disturbance that creates that bare soil, preventing the movement of weed seeds from one property to another, cleaning equipment, cleaning clothing. This is kind of an extreme example here. Maybe something as simple as limiting off-leash dogs in areas that have public access. In terms of when we're using materials like fill and soils and compost, using weed-free materials to avoid introducing new weed seeds, and of course, ongoing monitoring and regular inventories to help nip those infestations of noxious weeds in the bud. Early detection followed by rapid response means smaller patches, smaller crews, less soil damage, and no replacement plants. That kind of stitch in time saves 9 part of preventing weeds from becoming a problem. Early detection can result in better control and reduce the need for an amount of herbicide used. When we're looking at integrating multiple strategies for weed control, this can include cultural and mechanical strategies like establishing desirable and competitive plants in areas where weeds are likely to compete. Perennial native grasses, other competitive native vegetation can help keep invasive species out of parks and open space. After weeds have established, mechanical strategies like hand weeding and digging, mowing, flower head removal, even tilling are potential options for management of weeds. What works for you is going to depend on what kind of weeds you're dealing with, whether it's summer annuals, winter annuals, simple perennials, creeping perennials. Some of them are a lot easier to manage than others with cultural and mechanical options, and depends on the scale of what you're working to. It's pretty easy for me to hand pull weeds, use some mulch to keep my flower beds in order in my small yard, but that does get a lot trickier the more acreage that you're managing. So the more you can do to prevent weeds from emerging in the first place and then to rapidly respond to small infestations, the less need you might have for doing cleanup of hard to control mature weeds with herbicides. But I could again talk your ear off about non-chemical strategies, but it's unrealistic to think that we're going to eliminate all pesticide use, especially when herbicides in particular might be the only feasible strategy for managing certain noxious and difficult weeds. So in this part where herbicides are used, we want to be thinking about mitigation strategies that reduce both toxicity and exposure, both sides of that risk equation for pollinators when pesticides are used. So first up, we want to be avoiding use of the handful of herbicides known to be at least moderately toxic to pollinators, like paraquat. You can check what's known about impacts of different herbicides to bees based on that basic standardized testing we discussed, using the University of California's IPM Center Bee Precaution Pesticide Ranking Tool. But if that's hard to write down, just Google bee precaution and that online tool should come up. Then on the equation side of the risk, on the exposure side of the risk equation, we want to just be treating the area needed. For example, by using spot sprays with a backpack spray or a weed wiper or other targeted application method. Depending on that timing of application and the species of the plant, they might be ingested by pollinators and nectar. And that main window of concern with herbicides in terms of pollinator exposure is in the couple of days between application and when plants senesce due to the herbicide, if the plants are flowering at the time of application. So from kind of a management perspective, I would avoid applying systemic herbicides like glyphosate, triclopyr, imazapyr, et cetera, to bee attractive plants in bloom, and try to do what you can to limit direct exposure to pollinators. So this photo is a bit of a mixed bag. It's a backpack sprayer, which is more targeted than some application methods, but that's Japanese knotweed, and that's a pollinator attractive species in bloom. So in terms of minimizing exposure to pollinators, this, I guess, really isn't ideal. So again, one of the key ways that we can reduce risk to pollinators is to reduce the area treated and use application methods that are more targeted. I'm sure all of you are familiar with and aware of alternative targeted herbicide application methods, things like spot treatment, cut stem and basal bark treatments, wick wipes on individual plants or small areas, instead of these broadcast foliar sprays. So the less drift we create, the less chemical we use, the less likely we're creating a hazard for pollinators. Something to keep in mind is that depending on the herbicide, its systemicity and application, it could affect some neighboring trees or other wild plants. So like, for example, in the case of hack and squirt application, if the cut is too shallow, sometimes herbicide won't make it into the cut and will get washed out to neighboring plants. Some tree species also have roots that graft together to share nutrients. So highly mobile systemic herbicides like imazapyr, glyphosate, and 2,4-D can sometimes move between neighboring trees of the same species via these root grafts. So just need to be thinking carefully about what and how we're applying it, and limiting use to where it's going to be most effective and least disruptive, especially when there are flowering plants in the vicinity that are attractive to pollinators. So I just want to talk about one specific example of how you might mitigate the risk of herbicide use in invasive species management to pollinators. This is a photo of giant hogweed, which is a toxic perennial species, a Class A noxious weed that reaches 15 feet tall and grows in both urban and rural areas in several regions of the US. You may or may not recognize it, but if you know it, you know it. So this is a person for scale. This isn't even as tall as it gets. In sun, giant hogweed is one of those plants that has sap that when it contacts the skin can cause blistering and even scarring. So it can be a challenging plant to work with and remove. You don't need a Tyvek suit like in this photo, that's great, but long sleeves and basic PPE are recommended. So the thing about hogweed, like a lot of flowering weeds, is that its flowers are attractive to pollinators. So in terms of how we manage it, if herbicides are used when the plant is in bloom, pollinators have that window potential for exposure to take it up in nectar in the couple of days before the plant fully responds. So early on in infestations, alternatives to herbicide would be digging. Digging would be effective, but later on, digging is a real job. Every part of the plant can lead to blistering, and mowing and tilling are largely ineffective at preventing the spread. So larger, more mature infestations could need chemical control. So what do we do to mitigate risk to pollinators? So the key with this species, as well as many others that are really prolific seed producers, is to get ahead of management before it sets seed. So this is a 2-for-1 answer for managing this weed and protecting pollinators. Clipping flowering umbels, as you see in this photo, does the dual job of reducing seed production and reducing exposure risk to pollinators if you also want to apply herbicides to the plants when they're in flowering stage. So clip the umbels to stop the next year's spread and then apply herbicides to kill off the existing plants. I wish I had time to go into other examples here, but I just wanted to use this to emphasize that with this species and with others, what we're trying to do is avoid scenarios where herbicides are used on flowering plants, creating that window for pollinator exposure in the plant nectar before the plants die. There are usually other options for timing of intervention depending on the plant life cycle. And I know I'm probably getting short on time, but I did want to end by turning to a case study of site preparation for pollinator meadows, which is something that we get a lot of questions about. So site preparation means eradicating weeds to prepare areas for seeding so that the less competitive perennial native species have a better chance of germinating and succeeding at that site. Most site prep methods, I want to emphasize, including herbicides, including tillage, including solarization or tarping with plastic, have some kind of environmental trade-off. All of them remove floral resources for the year that they're in use. And most also include at least one tillage pass, which can have impacts on soil health. In terms of that soil health question, repeated cultivation, so repeated tillage, is probably the most impactful site prep method for the soil communities, soil invertebrate communities, and other soil metrics. Studies on herbicide impacts on those microbial communities, soil organic matter formation, other soil health metric are pretty mixed. Glyphosate appears to have some small mixed short-term impacts. Other herbicides could have more. Clear and black plastic also impact microbial communities, affect soil organic matter formation, and raise a variety of concerns about downstream effects of plastic pollution, like microplastic residues and leaching. So all of these have some kind of short-term loss involved, some kind of environmental impact. And yet effective site preparation is the most important contributor to the success of a restoration planting. So there is a real trade-off for that long-term gain of a diverse perennial planting. There is one alternative method that I wanted to mention, although there are some real caveats on it. It may be effective in areas, this is smother cropping with cover crops. It could be effective in areas with low weed pressure, but it does require really strict management. You can't forget about a cover crop and then expect it to work for site preparation. So this photo is from Hawthorne Valley Farm in New York, which is one of the largest biodynamic farms. They're very experienced with cover cropping, smother cropping. And so this strict timeline of having buckwheat basically done multiple times through the season to smother out other weed species in an area that had low weed pressure fit really well into their existing management structure. So, one other thing to think about, this is one option for something that it does involve a tillage pass, but also allows forage to be available for pollinators through the season. If there isn't much forage in the vicinity and loss of forage due to site preparation is your concern about using a particular method, one other option would be to find some space to plant some kind of annual mix or flowering cover crop that provides some nectar and pollen for bees during that year of meadow site prep. So just to talk about some options to help mitigate that trade-off of site preparation. I did want to try and visualize the difference between good site prep and poor site prep. On top, we have a full year of weed eradication with herbicides. These perennial native plantings tend to sleep in the first year, creep in the second year, and then leap in the third year if there's good site prep. That first year is awkward and messy looking as perennials are sending down roots. And then by year 3 to 4, you should be seeing more of a diverse perennial meadow. But what happens with poor control of competitive weeds? You get poor germination, poor establishment of native wildflowers. Your planting becomes dominated by flowering weeds, which might or might not have value to pollinators. So by year 3, you might not see that value of all those species you've seeded into the meadow, and it could be time to start over. Site preparation is a trade-off, but the upside is that effective weed control ahead of meadow seeding ensures much better establishment of native wildflowers and a longevity of these diverse plantings. So there's that short-term loss followed by a longer-term gain for pollinator communities. The lifespan of a diverse perennial meadow, when managed well, pays dividends for pollinators over decades. So to end, I just wanted to revisit our goal, which was what we set out at the beginning of this, building spaces for pollinators to thrive. Sometimes we use herbicides to create those spaces, but then we also want to do what we can to protect pollinators using flowering habitat from exposure to herbicides and other pesticides. So there's a lot of complexity to navigate here, and I hope that you'll bear with us as we navigate that complexity to try and find an approach to herbicides that keeps pollinator conservation front and center. So again, I'll point you to resources just like Sarah did. If you're interested in digging in for more detail on pesticides and pollinators, we have a lot of resources available on our website, xerces.org, ranging from publications diving into the impacts of different kinds of pesticides. We have a guide on organic pesticides, fungicides, an in-depth report on neonics, to fact sheets that are more how-to recommendations.
Emily, I think also they're on the Summit website, these links are available. And if whenever you're ready for questions, we are ready to throw some at you.
Great.
Okay. So we saw some herbicide reduction options for large area and for land managers. Thank you for that. But also there's quite a few homeowners, smaller land managers and regenerative farms online who are going entirely pesticide free. So that's totally an option, isn't it?
Yes, that is definitely an option and one that we encourage. This was really thinking about those restoration practitioners that are managing larger areas and really challenging weeds with very few people. That's where we see this place where other methods might not be feasible.
So let's talk about the inert ingredients a little bit. You covered some, and we're wondering just really how toxic are inert ingredients in your opinion? I know there hasn't been a lot of research in terms of their effects on pollinators, but I guess just your opinion. And then also, do you think standard testing will ever change to include inerts?
I think there is momentum growing around the need for additional risk assessment when it comes to inert ingredients. I think we're learning more just in the last decade about how they are contributing to toxicity for some of these end-use products. So I think, in the case of Roundup, it seems to be kind of that soapy detergent effect of the formulants is part of what is contributing to the toxicity of Roundup to bees in the studies that where that formulation was tested. In other cases, it seems to be impacts on, susceptibility to viruses and brood development in cases of co-formulants with insecticides. So I think we have a lot more to learn about how they are increasing the toxicity of the pesticide to bees. But a really important question, and one that I hope that regulatory systems are going to pick up on in the next decade, because it's this really important black box where we're learning more and getting more concerned with every new study about the importance of co-formulants for insect toxicity.
Great answer, thank you. And then we have one more for you. My 8-acre hobby farm is a pollinator oasis in a heavily sprayed ag area. And I notice drift impacts on plants. And I'm wondering if I'm creating a population sink by attracting pollinators into an area that's laced with chemicals.
This is a really challenging question, and one that I think we're trying to wrestle with at Xerces, which is what is the benefit of having flowering habitat versus the risk of that habitat being contaminated with pesticides. I think that in general, depending on what's being sprayed around you, if it's insecticides, that's much more of a concern than what we're seeing with the herbicide drift impacts, for example. I think the more that we can do to kind of protect flowering habitat from the impacts of drift, if you are surrounded by conventional agriculture and have the ability to put in some kind of drift barrier, like a coniferous, windbreak, that kind of thing, to help pick up, the most part of your drift from your neighbors that you can't prevent. That's a really good step for creating that oasis for pollinators. But I think it's a tough question to answer because in some cases, if you're not planting that habitat, there's nothing else for pollinators to feed on in the environment, contaminated or not. And so they're going to need that habitat to be able to survive and reproduce in that landscape. So I guess stay tuned. We're still working on that. But the more that you can do to protect your habitat from pesticides, the better protected the pollinators will be in it.